You would realize, he says, that putting a tariff in place, all that does is penalize American jobs in farming as opposed to American jobs in the other technology of making cars. All right, so that's one way to look at it. And what he's getting at there is that when you put on a tariff and you prevent foreigners from selling products to American consumers, that means they have less purchasing power with which to buy products from American exporters. And again, it gets tricky with fiat currencies, so it's easier if you think about it in terms of gold. If we were all on a gold standard, it wouldn't change the issue, just easier to think about it, and we put up high tariff barriers so that American consumers can send less gold to foreign producers, well, then that means they have less gold to then spend on the products of American exporters. All right, another way economists like to talk about is that ultimately the way a country pays for its imports is through exports. All right, that you think about the rest of the world, why are they sending us all these goodies? Why are they sending us TVs and cars and so forth? It's ultimately because we're sending something to them in return. It's not just because they're stupid, right? It's that they are, whether it's they're getting equity in American firms or whether they're getting other products and services, ultimately the reason these foreigners are sending us products is that we must be sending them something. So if you artificially hamper how many products they can send us, then that interferes with the business of American exporters. Okay, and then finally, the last thing, and then there's a few minutes for question and answer. The last one I'll talk about is that free trade creates jobs, right? So here I'll take a little dig at the pro-free trade crowd, that a lot of times, you spend so much time saying how free trade doesn't destroy jobs, then a lot of times advocates of free trade will say, look at, NAFTA from this date to this created, 600,000 new jobs, and that, free trade is the way to boost us, to grow the economy, and they'll talk using this language. And strictly speaking, that's not quite accurate. Free trade really isn't about jobs per se. It's about real wages. That as long as wages can float freely, anybody can get a job. Right? It's not an issue about creating jobs. There's always something that an extra person can do. That if someone needs work, it's not as if we're just going to be satiated and there's nothing that anybody can do, that no one can find work. There's always something you can do. So whether we have tariffs or perfectly free trade, everybody could be employed so long as wages are free to move, so that everyone can be hired who wants to work at the prevailing wage rate. So in that sense, free trade really doesn't create jobs. It just means that jobs would tend to pay more because people will go to where they have the comparative advantage. All right, now there's a little caveat there. To the extent that actually we don't have a perfectly free labor market, that there's Social Security, there's all these deadweight costs imposed, so that you actually have to have a minimum productivity before it's worthwhile for anybody to hire you. In that sense, if free trade raises everyone's productivity, more people get over that minimum bar. But I think a lot of free trade economists, that's not what they mean when they say, oh, free trade creates jobs. I think they're just being sloppy and want to give a nice soundbite to, for the Republican who claims to be for free trade. So with that optimistic note, I will end, and I think I've got like 2 minutes if anyone wants to ask a question. Yes?
You were right when you said people from poor countries might oppose free trade. I had a student from Egypt about 20 years ago tell me they could not afford free trade because they couldn't compete with the highly productive American workers.
Oh, well, yeah, that's interesting.
You were exactly on target.
Does anyone else want to compliment me? Yes, sir.
Could you comment on our growing deficit with China in terms of the massive amounts of dollars we're shipping over there and the massive amounts of goods they're shipping us? Is it fair to say that one of us needs the other more than the other?
Okay, yeah, that's a legitimate question, and again, it's hard to talk about these things. It makes the appearance that I'm saying, oh, everything's fine and there's not going to be any problems. And no, it's entirely possible that the dollar could fall next week and that we could be thrown into a huge recession. The point I would emphasize, though, is if that does happen, it's not because, oh, we had free trade and that led to all these imbalances. As far as China goes, yes, my understanding, and I don't claim to be an expert, is that the Chinese government is certainly using non-laissez-faire means to accumulate huge reserves of dollars, that they're keeping their currency artificially cheap in terms of the international market, so that favors their exporters. All right, so it's basically just the Chinese government is impoverishing its own people to favor certain exporters. Now, it's not a good thing in terms of their own people, but in the sense, is it hurting us? I don't think so, at least in the short term. If the Chinese government wants to just use its equivalent of tax dollars or slave labor to send us free goods, that doesn't make us poorer. Like, if they're sending us stuff that's artificially cheap, again, that we're getting presents, that's not actually hurting us, but it's to the extent that people become complacent and rely on that would be a bad thing. But again, that's not something government policies are going to alter. That's just, we might as well get the cheap goods while we can, and then just be aware that situation might change pretty soon.
Okay, thank you very much, Bob.